Well, can we turn to NATO for a little bit, because
Sure.
that has been another sort of recent thing that has come up. And Matt, you mentioned the piece by Pat Buchanan, which I believe was titled "Is Donald Trump the Peace Candidate?"
Yeah, he had about 75,000 question marks in this piece.
This is actually a question he doesn't bother trying to answer in the article, because he makes a very narrow case for. I'm being maybe generous, but he makes a narrow case for NATO in particular, and suggests that Donald Trump has the correct position on NATO, because Donald Trump suggests that we should not necessarily meet our obligations with respect to the treaties that are in place. And he went a step further and suggested that we should probably get out of the NATO agreement and instead use diplomacy and get the Russians to just say that they won't do things like go into Estonia.
The phrase in this fucking piece.
There's still promise.
Is that what we should do? We should trade, make a grand bargain, and we'll have Russia ensure the independence of the Baltic states.
Yeah. Which they've done a great job doing recently.
Ensure the independence of the Baltic states, and in return, we will withdraw NATO from those countries, and that should work out just fine.
What is important is Pat Buchanan is about a half step away from being a fascist. He always has been. He is somebody who worked for the Nixon administration gleefully and is about next to Roger Stone in excusing the crimes of the Nixon administration. He's been very generous to people like John Demjanjuk, the accused Nazi, who is definitely a camp guard. He has a long history of his insane policies. And after 1991, he went from Cold War warrior to somebody who was rather sympathetic, increasingly sympathetic to Russia, and mostly because he enjoyed the authoritarianism and the collusion with the Orthodox Church.
Last year, for example, he went on an extended jag about how Vladimir Putin was the last person defending marriage in the name of Christendom in a heathen world.
Yeah, and these are people that put sort of 19th century socialist issues above, the authoritarian tendencies and now just the flat authoritarianism of the Putin regime. And I mean, this stuff that, they should guarantee the sovereignty of countries whose sovereignty they've been trying to undermine since they were liberated in 1991. I mean, remember in 2007, the Russians launched major crippling cyber attacks in Estonia because the Estonians dared to take a statue out of Tallinn that was a Red Army statue from when they were occupied by, people don't like imperialism when they're talking in this kind of Howard Zinn, Chomskyite way. They seem to not mind imperialism. And I see there's a lot of people like Stephen F. Cohen from The Nation magazine who might as well just be getting checks from the Kremlin. They don't seem to mind imperialism when it's in the sphere of influence. These are distinct countries with distinct languages and cultures that have been occupied multiple times by aggressive Moscow.
Gary Johnson, when we interviewed him in Cleveland, made a Pat Buchanan point of like, hey, I don't think.
Jeez.
I'm lumping you fuckers together.
That's good. Yeah.
Because there's this idea, which is backwards, which in the way that Gary Johnson put it, and I criticized him and argued with him to his face about this, is that, well, how would we feel if Russia put their troops into Mexico? This is wrong think in a huge way. And here's why it's wrong think. Mexico doesn't want Russia. Mm. That's kind of an important difference, right? The Baltics are tiny countries, and when they shifted away from imperialist subjugation and into capitalist liberal democracies, they said, hey, you know what? We would love to not spend 90% of our GDP on defense. We would love to join an existing alliance. Tell us what we need to do to join. Now, we can argue about what should the alliance exist? Should it expand? Which countries belong? I, for one, don't think that Ukraine belongs, Georgia belongs in those countries.
I hope you don't think Turkey belongs.
It's sad. Well, yeah, Turkey's grandfathered in. I don't think Turkey belongs. I think I lived in that part of the world when Hungary and the Czech Republic and Slovakia and Poland joined And the great misnomer by idiots in America, by which I mean Thomas L. Friedman, was that it was somehow like a big play of an American, Czech ethnic lobby that allowed this to happen, as if there would ever be a thing like the Czech ethnic lobby in this country. No, it was Václav Havel, Arpad Gens, Lech Walesa, and whoever the hell from Slovakia who were at the christening or the groundbreaking of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. Bill Clinton did not want to expand NATO. It wasn't on his things to do list. It was a pain in his ass. He thought, like a lot of people thought, hey, look, Cold War's over. We got to come up with something. And what all these guys said is, I can't believe that you're going to talk here and have your pious comments about a Holocaust museum, which is a museum talking about what happens when one of these big countries straddling Central Europe decides to subjugate the other and start persecuting minorities. You're going to talk about all of that, and yet we still have, in many cases, Russian bases on our soil, and we don't have security guarantees, and we would have to spend all of our money on becoming a garrison state in order to defend ourselves. You need to expand NATO. So it was them asking. It was them acting as an individual sovereign state and requesting. It wasn't America saying, how close can we get to Russia to stick a middle finger up into their eye? And that's the way that it is frequently talked about, and that is just fucking wrong.
And I follow all of that. I think that the fundamental question from strident non-interventionists like myself, not Pat Buchanan, and I won't even speak for Gary Johnson, but for me, is where do you decide to draw these lines? Because it seems somewhat arbitrary. I mean, it's not as though there isn't a minority population in the Middle East, in a particular place, Iraq, that we just liberated not too long ago, that was making similar requests, that wanted to be able to set up a state of their own and be autonomous.
Let me answer your question.
That has been branded a terrorist organization by a member of NATO and has been persecuted and had all sorts of other horrible things happen to them. And there are various other places.
In the early 90s, or through to about the late 90s, there were a series of requirements. One is that you had to have pass certain thresholds of rule of law. You had resolved all outstanding border disputes with neighboring countries. You had to respect and have legal protection for minorities within your own country, particularly minorities who belong to minorities that live in surrounding countries. So the Baltics, especially Lithuania, I believe, have a lot of ethnic Russians. And I still don't think that they have as many protections as they should in the Baltics, though Michael probably knows more about this than I do. And so there was this series of things. And that actually, the NATO accession talks actually calmed down what was nearly at least a heavy breathing series of incidents between Hungary and Slovakia back then. It calmed those tensions way down. So if you passed all these hoops, this is why I say Ukraine and Georgia and some other Romania, I think, came in too soon. Bulgaria came in too soon. They don't have as much rule of law. Like, you got to get your shit together. And obviously we as Americans, and I don't think that this was ever done in a proper way. And this is the one place that I think that Thomas L. Friedman's have a point. You talk about it, let's have a discussion about it. There wasn't a lot of public discussion about it, and a lot of it was super ill-informed. But what those countries were arguing was just simply that, okay, you can have your theoretical conversations. Meanwhile, there's a power vacuum here, and we don't want to be invaded by bad guys. Yeah. So can we join your club if we pass the test? There's no country in the Middle East that would come close to any of that stuff. And most of the countries, even on the rims of the former near abroad and the former Soviet territories, wouldn't pass those territories. We've let some of those standards slip, and I think that is a mistake.
And as you know, Michael, I'm not a blame America first person. My perspective is
you're blame America second person.
No. My thing is that the universe is
you're blame the white man.
No,
first.
no. The world is complicated. There are often unintended consequences to the best of intended actions that have been well thought out. And I do wonder, like, at what point does the United States go and engage in a military conflict in order to prevent something bad from happening someplace else? I think, Matt, you have laid out the case ably for NATO. I understand your perspective. I wouldn't argue that NATO has had nothing but miserable consequences. I wouldn't suggest that at all. I think in general, certainly for that part of the world, that the consequences thus far have been largely beneficial. That said, going forward and in general, I don't know that having the sort of alliance that might actually precipitate like a for real like shooting war between the United States and Russia in order to preserve the sovereignty of
Small,
any,
really cool countries.
Sure,
that should exist.
I'm not sure if that's something that should be triggered automatically. At a minimum, it seems to me that there ought to be a conversation that happens like now.
I agree. I just would point out that deterrence, and this is true also of nuclear weapons, deterrence is a thing.
Okay,
and it's
the deterrence doesn't
thing.
disappear if it is not automated. That's all I'm saying. It doesn't disappear. Perhaps it diminishes.
In the case of the Baltics, and in the case of Pat Buchanan's grand bargain, it would. If we removed our security guarantees, Russia would invade the Baltics. Of that, I would bet my life savings, which admittedly isn't very much.